The atomic bombings of Japan might well be one of the most important events in human history, so maybe it's no surprise that they're also one of the strangest. As plans for a nuclear attack on Japan took shape, American military planners drew up a list of target cities. One of those cities was Kyoto. Prior to the Meiji Restoration, Kyoto had been Japan's capital. In fact, the name literally means capital city in Japanese. For that reason, it holds a special place in the country's culture, and the city has long been famed for its beauty and heritage. Anyone who's seen Oppenheimer will probably know where this is going.
My wife and I honeymooned there. It's a magnificent city.
The U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had honeymooned in Kyoto a number of years before the war. Having become pretty fond of the place, he took Kyoto off the target list every time it was added, eventually taking his case to President Truman. Stimson argued that the destruction of beautiful historic Kyoto would only harden the Japanese people against a future American occupation. Heck, it might even cause them to align themselves with the Soviet sphere of influence, and you can just imagine what Truman thought of that. In the end, Stimson won out, and Kyoto was spared the destruction of the atomic bombs. Nagasaki was chosen in its place. Although that city had its own historical heritage and some significance as the heart of Japanese Christianity, this wasn't enough to save it. The bombs that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the same in the sense that they were both nuclear weapons, but they differed in a few key ways. Both bombs were detonated by forcing a mass of unstable radioactive material to go supercritical, setting off a chain reaction of shattered atoms. But Hiroshima's little boy bomb used two lumps of refined uranium, which fired at each other like paired bullets. Nagasaki's Fat Man, meanwhile, relied on a plutonium core. This core was activated by the detonation of a spear of conventional explosives around it. The concept of a plutonium bomb became reality at the Trinity test in July 1945, but uranium bombs had never been tested before the attack on Hiroshima. Scientists were very confident that they'd work, though, and the form of uranium required for a working weapon was so hard to isolate that no one wanted to waste a bomb's worth of it just to confirm what they already knew. Still, the attacks themselves became a kind of proving ground for atomic theory. The destruction of Nagasaki proved that plutonium weapons were more devastating and efficient, and so most of America's subsequent nuclear weapons have followed the basic principles of Fat Man. Nagasaki tends to be discussed less than Hiroshima, unfairly but for understandable reasons. Even in Japan, the news of the second atomic attack was overshadowed by the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, which had begun that same day. And while it seems a little perverse to call this luck, the circumstances of the bombing of Nagasaki meant that the city wasn't damaged quite as badly as Hiroshima. Originally, the US had planned to hit the city of Kokura with the second atomic bomb. On the morning of the attack, though, Kokura was covered in smoke from a nearby bombing raid, and so the bombers were forced to turn toward Nagasaki instead. But the population of Nagasaki was concentrated in two valleys cutting outward from the city's harbor, and cloud cover on that fatal day meant that visibility was even worse than that over Kokura. Low on fuel, and with just a single gap in the clouds to use, the bombers did what they could, dropping their payload over one of the valleys some distance north of the city center. Even though Nagasaki's weapon was much more powerful than the one that hit Hiroshima, the shielding effect of the terrain and the suboptimal hypocenter blunted its effect. Nevertheless, the effects of the Nagasaki bomb were devastating. There's been a lot of debate and revision over the death toll over the years, but it's now widely believed that some 70,000 people were killed, with a similar number injured. After Japan's surrender, the US government sent a Manhattan Project physicist named Philip Morrison to Hiroshima to survey the damage. Having witnessed the scale of the devastation caused by the bombs, Morrison went on to campaign against the development of more nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. Before the bombings, Joseph Stalin had correctly interpreted a casual comment from Harry Truman as a reference to America's nuclear program, and so he leaned on his own scientists to speed up production of a Soviet bomb. This project was accelerated further after the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the USSR successfully tested its first lightning weapon in 1949. Activists around the world have long stressed the apocalyptic potential of nuclear weapons, arguing that they're expensive and morally unjustifiable, to say nothing of the fact that they could destroy humanity many times over. A number of regional treaties have banned the development of nuclear weapons across Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific, but 9 countries continue to operate nuclear arsenals, with weapons deployed across a further 6. In total, it's thought that humanity now wields some 12,000 nuclear bombs.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
The Trinity test was the first of some 500 above-ground nuclear detonations that took place before international treaties literally forced nuclear testing underground. One of the key consequences of these tests was the spread of carbon-14, a radioactive form of carbon that now exists in the tissues of every living organism on Earth. Weirdly enough, there have been a few benefits to this. Carbon-14 is useful for scientists because it decays slowly over time. This means that by measuring the amount of carbon-14 left in a given sample, they can estimate its age. Before the advent of nuclear weapons, this method was limited mostly to older materials, as carbon-14 decays so slowly that it needs time for the amount of decay to become detectable. In the post-nuclear world, however, carbon dating has become both more precise and applicable to younger items. Today, it has all kinds of uses, from catching poachers to verifying the vintages of fine wines. And while the amount of carbon-14 in the environment has now settled close to pre-bomb levels, it'll be detectable in organisms that lived through the atomic age for the next 60,000 years.
If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
The exact death toll of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki will never be known for sure. In the late days of the war, Japan was in total disarray, with countless refugees fleeing conventional bombing raids in other cities. Some people had evacuated Hiroshima and Nagasaki before the attacks, others might have moved into the cities, and a significant number of unregistered and enslaved Koreans had been assigned to work in each city. Commuters who worked in the city but lived outside of it might have died in the blasts, but they wouldn't have been named on the lists of residents. The bombs were also capable of totally destroying a human body at close range, and in the desperate days in the aftermath of the attacks, many of the dead had to be hurriedly buried or cremated without being identified or tabulated. Others were buried in rubble and found much later on. On top of all that, the bombings destroyed a number of civic records in both cities. Historians have also struggled to agree on what deaths counts as being caused by the bombs. A record from Nagasaki in October 1945 figured some 23,000 deaths, but this was almost certainly an underestimate, as it failed to account for the chaos of the destruction, people who had fled the city since the bombing, and the slow progress of deaths by radiation poisoning or other injuries. The development of cancer among survivors only added to the toll, probably in the very rough neighborhood of 3,000 additional deaths. All we know for certain is that, at the very least, tens of thousands of people were killed by each bombing. Hibakusha is a Japanese term meaning bomb-affected people, essentially the survivors of the atomic bombings. Japan's legal system sorts these people into various categories depending on their proximity to the detonations, even including those who were in utero at the time. After a little foot-dragging and a lot of pressure from advocacy groups, Japan's government enacted 2 laws for the aid and support of Hibakusha, including a monthly stipend for all survivors. Despite those measures, Hibakusha often faced discrimination from their fellow citizens, with other Japanese people sometimes refusing to hire or marry them. This stigma led some to conceal their victimhood even from their own children. Today, Hibakusha advocacy groups continue to fight for their rights, as well as a world without nuclear weapons. One such group, Nihon Hidankyo, won the 2024 Nobel Peace Prize for its work. Another organization, Hibakusha Stories, is dedicated to collecting testimonies from survivors. More recently, they've expanded their mission to include supporting other people affected by the production of atomic weapons. This includes those who were affected by the Fukushima incident, so-called downwinders exposed to the effects of nuclear tests, and the people involved in the construction of the weapons themselves. Even after all this time, historians, politicians, and members of the public continue to argue over whether the atomic bombings of Japan were justified. One side argues that a conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands would have cost countless American and Japanese lives, and so the use of the bombs were necessary to bring a final end to the war. Those who disagree point to the enormous devastation wrought by the bombs and their colossal death toll, as well as the fact that most of those killed were civilians. This debate is only complicated further by Japan's situation in August 1945. One sticking point in negotiations at the time was the Allies' refusal to guarantee that the emperor could keep his throne. Since Hirohito was ultimately allowed to remain as emperor, however, it's been argued that this was not a quibble worth tens of thousands of lives. Additionally, it's been argued that the enormous success of the USSR's invasion of Manchuria could have led to a quick surrender anyway. It's unlikely that this argument will ever be settled, of course, but if that remains the extent of mankind's quarrel over nuclear weapons, well, we should probably count ourselves pretty lucky.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped 1 bomb on Hiroshima.
In general, government officials at the time believed the bombs were a necessity to avoid a far more costly invasion. President Truman is quoted as saying, "It was a terrible decision, but I made it. I made it to save 250,000 boys from the United States, and I'd make it again under similar circumstances." But if the intention was to force Japan's surrender, the bombs might have been totally unnecessary. Evidence suggests that Japan was ready to surrender before Hiroshima. First, a personal piece of correspondence penned by Emperor Hirohito and sent to Joseph Stalin asked that the Soviet premier act as an intermediary in negotiations between Japan and the US. It's not clear when Stalin received this letter, but it was definitely before the Potsdam Conference. the meeting between Allied leaders regarding the end of World War II, which took place from July 17th to August 2nd. Hiroshima wasn't attacked until 4 days after that. On top of that, a study called the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey found that Japan would have likely surrendered before the Allies could invade. In other words, before many of the casualties that U.S. officials feared. The report was finished in September 1945 and published the next month, so after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. It should be noted, though, that historians heavily debate these points. What's not debated is the role the USSR played in ending the conflict. Whether or not Japan was prepared to surrender beforehand, the typical narrative is that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the catalyst for the end of the war. On the surface, that seems consistent. Hiroshima was attacked on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th, and Japan announced its surrender on August 14th. The timeline seems pretty cut and dry. But one thing most people don't look at is the fact that on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. That act might have a bit more weight to it than you thought. For context, the Soviet Union and Japan had entered into a neutrality pact in 1941. The agreement was beneficial to both countries because it allowed both of them to focus on fewer fronts during World War II. But as the war with Germany turned in favor of the Allies, Stalin warmed to the idea of joining in the war against Japan, even though the neutrality pact was technically still in effect. As such, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria the day after declaring war was nothing less than a betrayal. In just under a week, the Soviet army was moving on 3 different fronts against Japan, even finding success in areas of significant resistance. In discussions with his cabinet, Hirohito explicitly mentioned the Soviet Union in relation to surrender. The military situation has changed suddenly. The Soviet Union entered the war against us. Therefore, there is no alternative but to accept the Potsdam terms. We're not trying to downplay the decision to drop atomic bombs in some sort of modern-day retelling of history, but by Japan's own words, the Soviets played a major role in their surrender. With the Soviet Union on the rise, the end of World War II might be better analyzed as the start of the Cold War, as American leaders began exerting pressure on the Soviets. Though nuclear research had previously been kept secret from the USSR, Truman changed that policy as it became clear that the Soviets were poised to affect the balance of power in East Asia. The US preferred that the USSR be given as little power as possible in that situation, so Truman let it slip that American scientists had developed a uniquely deadly weapon. After all, as a deterrent, it's pointless if your enemies don't know you have it.
Whole point of the doomsday machine is lost. If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
Historians now know that the concept of a nuclear weapon had Joseph Stalin fairly concerned. Combine that fact with indications from that 1945 study that Japan would have surrendered without the atomic bomb, and you can now see how modern eyes view the bombings more as a show of force to the Soviet Union. The bombs were likely more of a show of power than a military strategy, giving the US a stronger bargaining chip when it came to post-war negotiations. Again, we're parsing this mainly on that 1945 study and the words of the Japanese leadership, and not factoring in all the other factors such as the never surrender mentality of the Japanese military and the horrific war crimes they carried out. So yes, you can blast us in the comments. Go ahead. We're just trying to show both sides here. Prior to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the US did technically take precautions to warn the civilian populations of their target cities. Airdrop pamphlets urged the Japanese people to pressure their government into surrender, making mention of an incredibly powerful weapon that they would face if the war continued. The pamphlets themselves contained intimidating images of American military might, as well as lists of cities that might be targeted for attacks. A reported 33 cities received at least one of the 3 versions of the pamphlet, each of which had a slightly different list of target cities. But 2 cities that weren't listed on any of them were, you guessed it, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Nagasaki makes sense since that wasn't on the initial list of targets, but Hiroshima is a strange omission. In the end, their citizens were entirely unaware that an attack was imminent, with reports from Hiroshima even explaining that the locals just thought it a beautiful normal day. Looking back at them today, Hiroshima and Nagasaki feel like 2 self-contained events relegated to their own dark shrine in history. But horrifying as it is to think about, there could have been many more bombings. See, even though the Trinity test had gone off without a hitch, the bombs slated for deployment were untested designs.
Could the bomb work? That would certainly have been the military view. We test them in action.
Scientists close to the project made a prediction about the atomic bomb's effect in a 1945 letter. In their own words, "It is doubtful whether the first available bombs, of comparatively low efficiency and small size, will be sufficient to break the will or ability of Japan to resist." Yeah, I got that one wrong. But believe it or not, even after seeing proof of their effectiveness, the US military was still ready to keep making and dropping even more bombs indefinitely. Shortly after the bombing of Nagasaki, military officials continued to make active plans for further attacks, including an outline that would include 7 more bombs deployed by the end of October that year. They were even planning the infrastructure needed to produce bombs consistently, at the rate of at least 3 per month. In a sense, it shows how the US military thought there would be no way that the Japanese would ever surrender. If there's one thing about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that almost everyone can agree on, it's that the radiation released by the bombs left thousands of people sick, and we now know what happened next.
The war ended, but not the dying. Radiation sickness would kill thousands more.
But some studies looking at survivors from the outskirts of the two cities suggest that the radiation wasn't always as damaging as commonly believed. In fact, it may have made some survivors healthier. The studies found that survivors who received low doses of ionizing radiation had a longer life expectancy and lower instances of cancer than the average population. Shocking findings, to say the least, considering everything we know about the dangers of radiation. The researchers chalked the phenomenon up to radiation hormesis, a theory that very low doses of ionizing radiation can actually be beneficial. Before you get up in arms in the comments again, we'll state for the record that organizations like the National Academy of Sciences and the United Nations don't recognize radiation hormesis as a valid theory, making these findings even more sketchy. And just to touch on one of the wildest stories to come out of the bombings, we have to mention Tsutomu Yamaguchi, who was in Hiroshima when Little Boy fell. He survived and went home to Nagasaki. On August 9th, he was telling a coworker about the bombing when Fat Man dropped.
He got 1,000 times the dose of radiation that we experienced in 1 year.
Against all odds, he lived a healthy life until he passed away in 2010 at the age of 93. Clearly, after almost 80 years to study the effects of what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's still a lot we don't understand. Today, Japan is still the only country to have been attacked with a nuclear weapon. The collective trauma caused by the bombs was compounded by an official code of silence under both the Japanese and American occupation governments. Japan, hoping to keep a lid on the panic, suppressed news of the bombings, and this policy was maintained by the American administration until 1949. Even today, as Japan presents itself as a voice against nuclear proliferation, the country utilizes nuclear power for energy, and some sections of Japanese society openly advocate for a Japanese nuclear stockpile. This complex relationship with nuclear weapons has been mirrored in Japanese culture, with perhaps the most famous example being this guy. One of Japan's most recognizable cultural exports, 1954's original Godzilla movie begins when the monster is woken from its sleep by H-bomb testing. It's a clear analogy for the dangers of nuclear weapons, and these movies have warned audiences for decades that no one can really know what might be unleashed by the use of such forces. Hiroshima Peace Park contains much of the area that once lay directly under the atomic blast, and inside the park stands a uniquely Japanese oddity, the Genbaku Dome. Before the bombing, the dome was a municipal exhibition building called the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotional Hall. It had been designed by a European to look European, which meant that among other things, it was made of concrete. So when the bomb went off almost directly overhead, it killed everyone inside, but the downward shockwave failed to totally destroy the building. As a result, the Genbaku Dome was the only surviving structure in its immediate vicinity. After public debate, the remains of the building were incorporated into Hiroshima's memorial to the victims of the bombing. Conservation projects since 1945 have prioritized keeping the structure as close to its appearance after the attack as possible, and in 1996 it was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The site also hosts annual memorials each year on the anniversary of the bombing.
Many lives were stolen after the atomic bomb. People who are alive need to know and study what happened and teach our grandchildren.
After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear warfare suddenly became a prominent and enduring threat. But in a mirror effect, the bombs also brought the potential for peace. Don't forget that the military thought that a deterrent had to be proven unequivocally in a theater of war, hence Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But before the bombs were ever dropped, scientists warned that doing so would have the opposite effect. See, folks were already concerned about what the future was going to look like with nuclear weapons now on the table. So in June 1945, a group of scientists who'd worked on the project penned what became known as the Franck Report, in which they argued that springing the bomb on the world would lead to deep distrust and further conflict. Later published in the 1946 issue of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the report stated that dropping the bomb on an enemy target would shatter any trust the world had in the United States' desires for truly lasting peace, saying, It will be very difficult to persuade the world that a nation which was capable of secretly preparing and suddenly releasing a weapon as indiscriminate as the rocket bomb and 1,000 times more destructive is to be trusted in its proclaimed desire of having such weapons abolished by international agreement. Instead, they suggested detonating a bomb on an uninhabited island somewhere and inviting the world to watch, a demonstration of both power and restraint. In their words, America would be able to say to the world, "You see what a weapon we had but did not use. We are ready to renounce its use in the future." This is a theory that is often seen as a modern Monday morning quarterbacking of World War II, but obviously the controversy associated with dropping the bombs has been around since before they were used. In 1945, what little scientific consensus existed around atomic weaponry predicted that the Earth at ground zero would be effectively dead. Scientists believed that nothing would grow in the affected area for some 70 years, but nature defied this belief. Weeds appeared at Hiroshima's ground zero within a few months. By the spring of 1946, oleanders were beginning to blossom, and the camphor trees that had survived the bombings produced new growth. The oleander and the camphor tree have since become recognized symbols of Hiroshima and its rebirth. Seedlings from those trees have been distributed worldwide as gestures of goodwill, and today nature thrives at Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park.